The warm glow of the setting sun filtered through the blinds of room 412 at St. Clara's Hospital, casting long, soft shadows across the bed. Walter Green lay propped against the pillows, his frail body barely making an impression on the mattress. At 82, he had weathered a long life filled with quiet joys and deep losses, but now he felt like a drifting ship with no anchor. The sterile beeps of the monitors were his only company. It had been days since Walter had seen another face beyond the hurried doctors and nurses who checked his vitals and adjusted his IV. They were kind enough but always too busy to linger. His children had moved far away long ago, their lives consumed with the demands of families and careers. On this particular evening, the loneliness pressed against him like a physical weight. Maria Delgado, a nurse nearing the end of a grueling 12-hour shift, stood in the hallway glancing at Walter's chart. The hospital buzzed with the usual end-of-day chaos, nurses signing off on their patients, janitors starting their rounds, and visitors saying hurried goodbyes. Yet Maria felt an inexplicable pull toward Walter's room. Something about the man's quiet solitude reminded her of her own father in the last months of his life. Her feet ached, her stomach rumbled, and she longed to go home to her tiny apartment, but her heart urged her to stay. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door with a soft knock. Walter turned his head slowly, his tired eyes meeting hers. "Hello, Mr. Green," Maria said gently, pulling a chair close to his bedside. "I thought I'd stop by before heading home. Do you mind if I sit with you for a bit?" Walter's thin lips curved into a small smile. "You've had a long day, young lady. Don't you have better things to do?" Maria chuckled softly. "Not really. Besides, I think everyone deserves a little company." For a moment, Walter said nothing, but his eyes glistened with unspoken gratitude. Maria leaned forward, resting her arms on the side of his bed. "Would you like to talk about anything, or maybe I can just sit here while you rest?" Walter hesitated, then nodded. "It's been a while since anyone's asked me that," he said, his voice faint but steady. "I used to be a teacher, you know, English literature. Spent 30 years in a classroom." Maria's face lit up. "That's amazing. What made you choose teaching?" "It wasn't for the money. That's for sure," Walter quipped, his smile widening. "I loved the way books could open up the world to kids. They'd walk into my classroom with no idea who Shakespeare or Steinbeck was, and by the end of the year they'd be quoting lines back to me." The warmth in his voice grew as he spoke, and Maria listened intently, occasionally prompting him with questions. Walter told her about his favorite novels, his years spent coaching the debate team, and the wife he had lost 10 years earlier to cancer. As he reminisced, the lines of worry and sorrow on his face seemed to soften. When Walter's voice grew tired, Maria reached for a book from the bedside table. "Would you like me to read to you?" she asked. He blinked in surprise. "You'd do that?" "Of course," Maria said, flipping through the pages. "What's life without a good story?" She began reading, her voice calm and melodic, filling the room with warmth. Walter closed his eyes, not to sleep but to savor the simple comfort of having someone near. For the first time in days, he felt less like a forgotten relic, and more like a person who mattered. Unbeknownst to them, the muffled sound of her reading carried through the thin hospital walls to the adjacent room, where a wealthy visitor named Charles Bennett sat beside his mother's bed. Charles, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, had come to check on his mother out of obligation rather than affection. He had spent his life consumed by his business empire, leaving little room for sentiment or relationships. But tonight, as he sat scrolling through his phone, the sound of Maria's voice reached him. It was soothing, genuine, and filled with a kindness that tugged at something long buried in his heart. Curious, he stepped into the hallway, following the sound. Peering into Walter's room, he saw Maria seated by the old man's bedside, her expression one of complete focus and care. She stayed long after the clock had signaled the end of her shift, her every action exuding patience and compassion. Charles lingered by the doorway, unnoticed, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt deeply moved. That night, As Maria finally left the hospital and walked home under the fading light, she carried the quiet satisfaction of having made someone's evening a little brighter. Little did she know, her simple act of kindness had not only comforted Walter but also awakened something unexpected in the heart of a man who had the means to change her life forever. The following evening, Maria found herself drawn back to Walter's room, even though it was her day off. She had spent the morning running errands and stretching her modest paycheck to cover groceries and bills. Yet, as evening approached, she couldn't shake the image of Walter sitting alone, his thin frame swallowed by the hospital bed. Carrying a small paper bag, she entered the hospital, waving to the receptionist with a shy smile. "I'm here to visit Mr. Green," she said. When she reached room 412, she knocked lightly before entering. Walter turned his head, his expression softening when he saw her. "Back again, Nurse Maria?" he asked, his voice tinged with surprise and a trace of humor. "Just Maria today," she said, pulling out a thermos and a small container from the bag. "And I thought you might like some tea. The hospital stuff isn't exactly gourmet." Walter chuckled, the sound faint but genuine. "Well, aren't I spoiled? What kind of tea is it?" "Chamomile. My mom used to make it for me when I was feeling under the weather," Maria replied as she poured the steaming liquid into a cup. She handed it to Walter, who cupped it in his hands like it was a treasure. As he sipped, Maria opened the container, revealing a slice of homemade banana bread. "I made this last night," she said, cutting it into smaller pieces. "I'm not much of a baker, but I think it turned out okay." Walter took a bite, his eyes closing in pleasure. "This is wonderful," he said. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It's no trouble," Maria replied. "I just figured you might need a little extra TLC." Walter smiled at her warmly, and for the next hour, they talked about simple things: his favorite authors, Maria's memories of growing up in a bustling neighborhood, and the little joys they both cherished. The conversation was easy, unhurried, and filled with moments of laughter that felt like small victories. Meanwhile, Charles Bennett had returned to the hospital, this time alone. His mother had stabilized and the doctors had assured him she was in good hands. Yet something kept him coming back, not for her sake, but for the sense of peace he'd felt the night before when he overheard Maria and Walter. As he walked past Walter's room, he paused again. The door was ajar, and he could see Maria sitting by the bed, her presence so natural it was as if she belonged there. Charles stood there for a long moment, captivated by the scene. He didn't understand why it affected him so deeply, but he couldn't deny the pull he felt. Later that night, as Maria was leaving the hospital, she nearly collided with Charles in the hallway. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, stepping aside. "No, it's my fault," Charles replied, his tone more sincere than she expected. "I noticed you with Mr. Green earlier. You seem to care a great deal about your patients." Maria blushed slightly, shrugging. "It's part of the job." "Not everyone would go above and beyond like you do," Charles said. He hesitated, then added, "I think it's admirable." Maria tilted her head, studying him. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett." "Charles Bennett," he said, extending his hand. "Maria Delgado," she replied, shaking it. "Are you visiting someone here?" "My mother," Charles said. "She's in the next room over." Maria nodded. "I hope she's doing okay." "She is," Charles replied, his voice softening. "But I have to admit, seeing you with Mr. Green reminded me of something I've been missing in my life." Maria raised an eyebrow, curious but unsure how to respond. "Well, sometimes it's the small things that make the biggest difference," she said after a moment. Charles nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right." They parted ways, but Charles couldn't stop thinking about Maria's selflessness. As he walked back to his car, he began to wonder if there was more he could do, not just for his mother but for people like Maria and Walter, who seemed to embody a quiet but profound kind of goodness. Back in her tiny apartment, Maria settled into her worn-out sofa, exhausted but content. She had no idea that her simple gesture of bringing tea and conversation had sparked a chain of events that would soon take her life in a direction she could never have imagined. The next morning, Maria returned to work, her schedule packed with rounds and paperwork. St. Clara's was perpetually understaffed, and the relentless demands left little room for anything beyond the essentials. Yet Maria found herself making time to check in on Walter, even if only for a few moments. "Good morning, Mr. Green," she said brightly as she entered his room. She adjusted his pillows and scanned his vitals, ensuring everything was in order. "How are we feeling today?" "Like a very lucky old man," Walter said with a soft chuckle. "Your tea and banana bread might have been the best medicine I've had here." Maria grinned. "I'll take that as a prescription request." As she worked, Maria noticed Walter seemed a little more animated than before. His voice had regained some strength, and his eyes sparkled when he spoke. It was a small victory, but Maria cherished it. For someone like Walter, who had so little, moments of joy were priceless. Later that day, as Maria was hurrying down the hallway, she spotted Charles Bennett standing outside his mother's room. He looked up as she passed, his gaze filled with something akin to purpose. "Maria," he called out, his voice hesitant but firm. She stopped, balancing a stack of charts in her arms. "Mr. Bennett, how's your mother today?" "She's doing well. Thank you," Charles said, stepping closer. He hesitated, as if unsure how to continue. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with you. Do you have a moment?" Maria glanced at the clock, torn between her duties and the curiosity in Charles's expression. "I can spare a few minutes," she said finally, setting the charts on a nearby counter. Charles gestured toward an empty bench by the windows, and they sat down together. For a moment, he seemed to struggle with his words, an uncharacteristic pause for a man so used to commanding attention. "I've been coming to this hospital for weeks now," he began. "At first it was just to see my mother, but something changed when I noticed you with Mr. Green." Maria tilted her head, unsure of where he was going. "What do you mean?" "The way you care for your patients," Charles said. "It's not just a job for you. It's personal. I've seen a lot of people in this hospital, doctors, nurses, but you're different." Maria's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I just do what I can," she said quietly. "Everyone deserves to feel cared for, especially when they're sick or alone." Charles nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly it. You see people, not just patients. And it's made me think about how I've been living my own life." Maria looked at him, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Charles hesitated, then sighed. "I've spent years building a business empire. I've made more money than I know what to do with. But I can't remember the last time I really connected with someone. Watching you and Mr. Green. It reminded me of something I've lost." Maria shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. Charles reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to her. "I'd like to do something to help," he said. "I have resources, connections, ways to make a difference. If you ever have an idea or a need, call me. Please." Maria stared at the card, the weight of his words sinking in. "Mr. Bennett, I appreciate this, but I'm just a nurse. I'm not sure what I could ask for." "Don't underestimate yourself," Charles said, his tone earnest. "Sometimes, it's the people who think they're small who make the biggest impact." Before she could respond, a call over the intercom summoned her back to her duties. She tucked the card into her pocket, offering him a polite smile. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. I'll think about it." As Maria returned to her rounds, she couldn't shake the conversation from her mind. She wasn't used to being noticed, let alone by someone like Charles. But her focus remained on her patients, especially Walter, whose condition continued to stabilize. That evening, Charles walked into his mother's room with a rare sense of clarity. For the first time, he sat by her bedside, holding her hand and talking to her about more than just her treatment plan. It was a small but significant shift, inspired by the quiet compassion he had witnessed in Maria. Back at home, Maria sat on her couch, turning Charles's card over in her hands. She had no idea what, if anything, she would ever ask for. Yet something told her that this moment was the beginning of a connection that could lead to more than she ever imagined. The following week, Maria's days fell into their usual rhythm: long hours at the hospital, quiet nights in her modest apartment, and fleeting moments of reflection about Charles Bennett's unexpected offer. His card remained tucked into the pocket of her bag, a small but persistent reminder of a possibility she couldn't quite define. Meanwhile, Walter Green's condition had stabilized enough for the doctors to consider discharging him. It was good news, yet Maria felt a pang of concern. Where would he go? Who would take care of him? She hadn't been able to uncover much about his family, and he never mentioned anyone who might be waiting for him. One afternoon, as Maria changed the dressing on his arm, she decided to ask, "Mr. Green, have you thought about what happens when you leave here? Will someone be helping you at home?" Walter gave her a sad smile. "I'm afraid there's no one left," he admitted. "My wife was my world, and after she passed, well, the kids drifted. They call every now and then, but they have their own lives." Maria's heart sank. "You shouldn't have to go through this alone," she said softly. Walter patted her hand. "Don't worry about me, dear. I'll manage. I always do." But Maria couldn't let it go. That evening, as she sat in the break room sipping lukewarm coffee, she pulled out Charles's card. Her mind raced with questions. Could she really call him? What would she even ask for? After several minutes of hesitation, she took a deep breath and dialed the number. Charles Bennett speaking came his crisp, professional voice on the other end. "Mr. Bennett?" "It's Maria," she said, her voice slightly shaky. "The nurse you spoke to last week." "Maria," Charles said, his tone instantly warming. "I was hoping I'd hear from you. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, then launched into an explanation about Walter. She spoke of his loneliness, his resilience, and her fear that he might fall through the cracks once discharged. "I'm not sure if there's anything you can do," she finished, "but I thought it was worth asking." Charles was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was firm. "Leave it to me." The next day, Charles arrived at the hospital, dressed in his usual sharp suit but with a demeanor far more personal than professional. He asked to meet with Walter, and after Maria introduced them, Charles sat by the old man's bedside, listening intently to his story. "I may have a solution," Charles said after some time. "I have a small foundation that provides housing and care for seniors who need it. It's well-staffed, comfortable, and not far from here. If you're open to it, I'd like to offer you a place there." Walter's eyes widened in disbelief. "That sounds too good to be true," he murmured. "It's true," Charles assured him. "Consider it a gesture of gratitude for everything you've given as a teacher. People like you shaped my generation, and it's the least I can do." Tears welled in Walter's eyes, and Maria stood by, barely able to contain her emotions. She had never seen such an unprompted act of generosity. Over the next week, arrangements were made for Walter's transition. Maria helped pack his few belongings, ensuring he had everything he needed. On the day of his discharge, she accompanied him to his new residence, a cozy room in a cheerful facility with a garden and a library stocked with classics. As they said goodbye, Walter gripped Maria's hand tightly. "You've been my angel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." "You've already thanked me, Mr. Green," Maria replied, tears in her eyes. "Just promise me you'll enjoy this next chapter." Later that evening, as Maria was leaving the hospital, she found Charles waiting for her in the parking lot. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his tone sincere. "Thank me?" Maria asked, bewildered. "You're the one who helped Walter." Charles smiled faintly. "But you're the one who cared enough to ask. Most people wouldn't have." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you," he said, handing it to her. Maria hesitated. "What is it?" "Call it a token of appreciation," Charles said. You've reminded me of what it means to truly connect with people. It's something I'd lost sight of, and for that I owe you more than I can say." When Maria opened the envelope later that night, she found a check for $5,000 inside. She stared at it in disbelief, her heart racing. For someone living paycheck to paycheck, it felt like a fortune. But beyond the money, it was the recognition of her work, her humanity, that brought her to tears. For days, Maria wrestled with what to do about the check. It felt too much, too overwhelming, yet returning it seemed ungrateful. In the end, she decided to do something that felt true to herself. At work, Maria continued her routine with a renewed sense of purpose. Walter was settling into his new home, calling her every few days to share updates about the books he was reading or the new friends he'd made. The joy in his voice warmed Maria's heart, and she couldn't help but feel proud of the role she'd played in his happiness. One evening, as Maria folded laundry in her small apartment, her phone rang. It was Charles. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "No, not at all," Maria replied, balancing the phone on her shoulder. "Is everything okay?" "I've been thinking about something Charles said. The way you've dedicated yourself to your patients, it's remarkable. But it's clear to me you're working within a system that doesn't always give you the support you deserve. I've been wondering if we could do something about that." Maria frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I'd like to invest in something bigger," Charles explained. "A community program, maybe a small foundation, where people like Walter and the nurses who care for them can find the resources they need. You have the heart for this kind of work, Maria. I think you could lead something incredible." Maria was stunned. "You want me to run a foundation?" "With help, of course," Charles said with a chuckle. "I'd fund it, but the vision would be yours. You already know what people need, you've lived it. All I'd be doing is amplifying what you're already so good at." The idea felt impossibly large, but as Charles continued, Maria began to imagine what such a program could look like: a space where seniors like Walter could find companionship, where underfunded nurses could access training and support, and where small acts of kindness could ripple outward into something transformative. "I'll think about it," Maria said finally, her voice trembling with equal parts fear and excitement. Over the next few months, Charles worked closely with Maria to bring her vision to life. They rented a modest office space and began building connections with local hospitals, senior care facilities, and community organizations. Maria used part of the check Charles had given her to fund small gestures that made a big difference: care packages for seniors, free workshops for nurses, and even weekly gatherings where patients could connect over tea and conversation. The program, which they named the Heart's Foundation, grew quickly. Maria's genuine care and insight drew volunteers from all walks of life, and Charles's financial backing ensured they had the resources to make a lasting impact. One afternoon, Walter visited the foundation's office, walking with the help of a cane but radiating vitality. He sat with Maria and Charles, marveling at how far things had come. "You two are a force to be reckoned with," he said, smiling. "If this is what kindness can do, the world could use a lot more of it." Maria glanced at Charles, who nodded in agreement. "It all started with you, Walter," she said. "Your story reminded me why I became a nurse, and it reminded Charles what it means to truly give." As the weeks turned into months, Maria's life transformed in ways she never could have anticipated. She still worked at the hospital, but her evenings were spent at the foundation, nurturing its growth. She moved into a slightly larger apartment closer to work, the financial burden eased by her new opportunities. The partnership between Maria and Charles deepened, not just as colleagues but as friends who had discovered a shared purpose. Maria saw a side of Charles that few had: a man driven not by wealth but by a newfound desire to create meaningful change. One evening, after a long day at the foundation, Maria and Charles sat on a bench overlooking the city skyline. "Do you ever think about how all this started?" Charles asked, his voice thoughtful. Maria nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "It started with Walter and a cup of tea." "And you," Charles added. "It started because you cared enough to stay." Maria looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. Maybe that's all it takes, she said. One moment of kindness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and orange, Maria felt a quiet joy she couldn't quite put into words. She had started with nothing but her instinct to care, and now she was part of something bigger than herself, a legacy of compassion that would endure. In that moment, she realized she hadn't just changed Walter's life. He had changed hers too.